Good evening, everybody. Welcome to The Rest is History. I suppose for a lot of you, it's not evening. Good evening, Tom. Lovely to see you.
Hello, Dominic. Hello, everyone. Lovely to be joining you. A little bit late if you're in England, but probably maybe better for other people. I don't know.
Yeah. So for one,
other time zones.
So for once, this is slightly more convenient for our American listeners. I don't know if you're Australian or in New Zealand, where we've just been, Tom. I don't know. God knows
I can't
what
work
time
it
it
out.
is.
I could never
9 a.m. or something. Anyway, we're delighted to have you whenever you are. We always like to do, for newcomers to the live streams, we always like to do a few shout outs to people who we can see their comments in the live chat, which you'll see at the side. So among the first to join, Tony from Houston, Stuart from the excellently named Port Fairy in Australia.
That's a good name.
It's a very good name.
Yeah.
Lisa's from Norwich. Gavin put his address as Londinium.
Could
Lara
I
from
just
Melbourne.
highlight Benji Lay, who's got an excellent question. Has Tom been murdered on BBC Two yet?
So is this tonight or tomorrow?
It's on right now. The Ides of
right
March.
Now.
Me as Julius Caesar.
Yeah. So Tom, for those of you who don't know, is in a documentary on British TV, BBC Two, about the assassination of Julius Caesar.
Yeah,
and you're sort of ventriloquizing Julius Caesar on here, is that right?
So people have the choice; they can watch me be murdered on BBC Two, or watch me, Dominic, be murdered by you.
Very good, very good. Because I'm going to be quizzing you in a little bit, but just to finish the shout outs: Rosalind from North Carolina, Hans from Vorburg, the excellently named. I don't know if this is a name or title or a nickname. Ott from Estonia, Martha from Wyoming, Patrick, who claims he's from the Texas Book Depository or in the Texas Book Depository, hard to tell, and a couple of old friends of the show, Tom. So Tim G, who I think holds the record for he was the first person in the history of The Rest is History to say that The Rest is History wasn't as good as it used to be. And I think that was probably in about October 2020
or something.
Yeah, exactly. So Tim G is here. And of course, our old friend, Deacon Paul O'Connor.
Wonderful to see him every time.
I know you always like to see, though we sadly didn't get to his Birmingham event, did we, Tom? That you're very guilty about.
We did.
Right. So everybody, it's brilliant to be here. And thank you so much to all of you for joining. What we thought we would do this evening, especially because we have a lot of new members of the Rest is History Club. Tim G, we do care about the old ones just as much. Don't worry. We have a lot of new members, so we thought it would be fun to complete a diptych that we started about 18 months ago. So back in the mist of time, Tom, you interviewed me about my historical career. So we thought we would kick off this live stream by talking to you about your own work and how you got into history and the themes that you have kind of traced through your career. So the first thing to say is that you didn't actually do history. That's one of the remarkable things. And actually one of the things I think that makes Tim Vasby-Burney wanting a shout out for Vickers. He's just gutted we didn't mention him, Tom. That's the truth of the matter. All the Vickers are working very hard this month. They are. No shout out to those who employ guitars, though, Tom. I think it's fair to say. The question from Tim Vasby-Burney. I don't know. I haven't been to one of his services.
We're not having that.
Old school or nothing, Tim, I'm afraid. Anyway, listen, Tom, you didn't do history at university. You did English.
Yes.
So, first of all, that is a pretty big starting point for somebody who presents a history podcast, that you didn't do history.
I'm a
fraud.
Do
you think that has... No, I don't think you are a fraud, he says kindly. But how do you think that has affected the way you interpret history or you write about it?
When I was choosing what to do, I was a three-way split between doing history, which was my first love, or classics, which was also kind of my first love, or English, which was a late enthusiasm. I just suddenly got the bug about a year before I had to apply. And I was suddenly all over it. And, Byron and Shakespeare and Joyce and everything. And it was kind of an intoxication. And I got this kind of idea that I wanted to be a great novelist. This was going to be my life ambition. And so I thought, well, I should go to university. And to be honest, it was because I thought I read history all the time, but I I genuinely want to be taught and to learn more about literature, because I don't know, I haven't been reading it all my life. So I thought that simultaneously I would learn more, and it would set me up to be a great novelist. But it didn't work out like that, because
I'm not dissing your novels, Tom, but they're not Dickens.
no, I know, but I went off to do a doctorate at Oxford, and it was on Byron and his relationship to antiquity, because I thought that's ticking all the boxes.
Yeah.
But I just found that Byron was a hopeless subject to write academic ease about, because he's not as a figure, he doesn't lend himself to the kind of stuff that doctoral students are meant to write about. So I gave it up and wrote a novel in which Byron was a vampire, which seemed a much better way of responding to his oeuvre. And
so,
also, but also it was a way of making money, because if I was going to be a great novelist, I needed money, which is why I'd been doing the doctorate. And so I thought, well, I'll just knock this book out. But the problem was, because the book did well, I then got I signed a deal which I had to do 3 more. So instead of becoming a great novelist, I was writing vampire novels, which had never been part of the plan. I wasn't really very interested in vampires. And I kept kind of thinking, how am I writing about vampires? This isn't my life. This wasn't my career at all. What?
But Tom, how did that affect the way that you oh, thank you, Theo.
So that's me at Newstead Abbey.
Yeah.
Next to the tomb of Bosun, his dog. Who
and do you know what I'm doing there, Tom? Talking to myself.
Well, there's a surprise. You look as if you're very interested in your conversation.
Yeah, it's a brilliant conversation.
Yeah.
So, Tom, how has that? Obviously, you ended up writing history eventually, which we'll come to. But how do you think that sort of those years doing first the undergrad English and then the doctoral stuff on English, which obviously you didn't, you walked away from it, but that must have changed the way you write history compared with people who did historical training.
Well, just to answer that rather roundabout way, I had a sense of what a great novelist should write about that I wasn't actually very interested in. But because I hadn't properly understood myself, and I hadn't understood the nature of literature and the nature of how you end up writing, I hadn't really realized that you don't choose what you want to write about. The sense of what you want to write about wells up from within inside you. And it took me time to realize what that was, because the vampire books were all set in periods of history. So Byron was telling, it was set in the Regency period. Then I did one set against the backdrop of Jack the Ripper, so in the 1880s. And then I did one set against the Restoration period, and it featured Rochester and Milton and so on. And then I did one set against the backdrop of Howard Carter discovering Tutankhamun's tomb, and it went right the way back to Akhenaten and all this kind of stuff. And I realized that there was a reason that I was setting them all in historical periods, which is that history was my great love. That's what I wanted to write about. But to answer your question, I was interested in the way that different periods was shaped. It wasn't so much that the way that literature held a mirror up to a society, but the way in which you could gauge how a society was different from us in the way, and the literature would be one of those expressions. And another expression would be its relationship to the supernatural. So actually, vampires were quite a good way into that, because vampires begin with Byron. 1880s, there's a huge explosion of interest in the supernatural. So it was the second one, Supping with Panthers. It featured She and Dorian Gray and Dracula and all these kind of, the fascination with the supernatural. And then, of course, going back to Milton, it was all about Satan and angels, and then with Akhenaten, it was Egyptian gods, and so that also was a theme. And when I came to write about history, it was recognizing that, particularly in the periods that I was most interested in, so the ancient and the medieval periods, that the text, so many of the texts were themselves literary. They were shaped as literature, and that to that extent, I think, one way that you can write history is to go against that, to blot that out, to dissect the sources so much that nothing of the literary quality is left. But another way, I think, is to write in a way that goes with the grain of it, and to import the literary quality of your sources into the fabric of what you're writing, which is what I ended up doing.
It's something that
Or at least what I try to do.
no academic historian would ever do.
No, I don't think so. So I think it's a very different technique.
Yeah. So we'll come to Rubicon in a second, which is your first history book. But just reading Rubicon, for example, or indeed any of your books, but let's take Rubicon. One would know within a page of reading it that it's not written by the reader in ancient history at the University of Sussex, let's say. But when you set out to go into history, to write nonfiction, did you think, okay, I'm not an academic, so I'm going to write it in a very non-academic way because obviously I want lots of readers and all this? Or did you think, I want well, I mean, presumably at some level you did think that, but also you thought, I want academics to take it seriously and to recognize that this is a serious engagement with the material, that I've read their stuff and that I have positions on debates that academics have. And were you sort of conscious of that tension from the beginning?
Yes, of course, but neither were my primary impulses. What I wanted to do when I wrote Rubicon was to get inside the head of an ancient people in the way that if I had genuinely been qualified to be a great novelist, I would have got inside the head of various characters living in the here and now. That's what I wanted to do, and I treated the idea of my working title for Rubicon was Citizens, which I never used because Simon Sharma used that as his
that would have been very punchy to use that.
Oh, look at that!
Here we are on Rubicon.
That's good to know.
Theo's favorite photo of you, and the former president of the Maldives, who doesn't have a chair, it seems.
That's wonderful.
Lying down.
I've never seen that.
Reading. Yeah, or maybe he's reading it through a hole in the floor. It's hard to tell, isn't it, from that picture?
But what I wanted was to convey for readers a sense of what it was like to live in the Republic and to have your life governed by by standards that are very different to ours.
Yeah.
And to do that, I didn't want to seem too much like a historian in the 21st century. So I didn't want to use the words that, ideology or othered or, all these kind of academic ease words that would immediately signal that I was someone from a different age studying it. I wanted to write it as though I'd kind of entered the world of the Romans, and that I was presenting their world as though it was natural.
Yeah, which is not what academics do, because academics,
no, I don't think so,
stand outside the past and dissect it, analyze it from the perspective of the present, don't they? And the pressure on a modern academic is very much to use the current vocabulary and terms and all that sort of stuff, right? So, you write about the Romans now. Presumably, I'm guessing that people write lots about gender fluidity, migration, all these things. I'm not saying those approaches are wrong, by the way. I'm just saying that's I've written
about gender fluidity and migration, but I wouldn't use those phrases because it would immediately stamp them as 21st century. There are, I would discourse. That's another word I would never use. It sounds too academic.
Nobody's allowed to use that, and the rest is history.
But what I thought was that if I could write in a way that was true to the mindset of the people that I was describing, then it would go with the grain of the source material. And in the source material, it's great, often great writing, particularly, whether it's Cicero writing his letters and his speeches in the context of a collapsing state, or whether it's Plutarch writing models of ancient lives that exist in the context of kind of broader ideas of what it is to be a hero. But there is a kind of tragic quality to all of these writings because the collapse of the Republic into civil war is the worst tragedy that the Romans can contemplate. And so I wanted people to read it and fit and share in the sense of tragedy, which was being generated partly because I felt an immense emotional attachment to the people that I was writing about and to the culture that I was writing about, but also because the sense of the tragedy is that it is a Roman one.
Right, because
that was what I was trying to do. That's what I was trying to do.
And why?
And I felt, and I think that that was one of the reasons why I didn't want to do history at university, was that I was afraid that there were two ways of doing it: either that you pin a butterfly to a slab and dissect it, or you watch it in a field. And I kind of wanted to do the watching it in a field rather than pinning it down. And I was worried that too close an analysis of inscriptions or whatever would
Yeah.
kind of kill it for me.
Yeah, I understand that. I understand. I mean, there is a sense that, speaking as a former academic, that there can be a slight joy, a joy that is lost amidst all the scholarly debates. The love of I mean, we talked about this many times. How, when you're in the middle of an academic history department, you do sometimes think to yourself, does anybody here actually like history? That kind of.
Yeah. Yeah.
But so
Yeah.
just a couple of questions on Rubicon, Tom. First of all, why Rubicon? Because your big enthusiasm, as long, people who listen to this a long time will know, was dinosaurs. And then obviously you had a massive passion for Byron, and you'd written that book on Byron, you'd written the vampire stuff. But why the Roman Republic?
Well, the Romans were my first historical love.
Okay.
I've talked about this so many times, but I would very, I did move seamlessly from dinosaurs to Romans because they're very similar. They're kind of big and fierce and glamorous, and I think safely extinct. So you can thrill to the terror and the dread and the carnivorous quality of them, while not feeling directly menaced by them. It's not like studying, I don't know, the Nazis. In many ways, the Romans are quite Nazi. The fact, the Nazis were inspired by Roman examples.
They were indeed.
But the Romans are sufficiently distant that they seem less menacing, while simultaneously being gratifyingly kind of apex predator-like.
Yeah.
But it wasn't just that. It was that the Romans, they kind of accompanied me throughout my education. So the first Roman poet who I really fell in love with, and often it's always invariably the same poet that young romantic kind of teenagers do fall in love with, was Catullus. And Catullus has this great love affair with this woman whom he calls Lesbia, inspired by the poems of Sappho. And it is a seriously held theory that Lesbia is to be identified with a woman called Clodia, who is the sister of Clodius, who is this gangster.
Yeah,
this posh gangster, upper class
roaming the
gangster,
streets of Rome,
roaming the
beating
streets.
people up.
But also, you mentioned gender fluidity, dressing up as a woman and gate crashing the religious ceremony that leads Caesar to divorce his wife because she has to be above suspicion. And Clodia is the victim of a legal assassination by Cicero, who has to defend his one of Clodia's lovers, whom she has accused of trying to poison him. And Cicero, rather than answer the substantial charges, just goes in and say, well, you can't trust her because she's a prostitute, and gives this devastating portrayal of this of her as a kind of upper class whore. And so the sense of gangsterdom, upper class whores, poets, it was all completely thrilling and provided a kind of new context for the drama of the Age of Caesar, which I'd got as a child, and also from Asterix, because that's the context. So I loved all that. So it was the period that I was most obsessed by. And I finally cracked that if you want to be a writer, you should write about what you most love and what you're most interested in. And that was what I most loved. And I remember when I got the commission for it, thinking, I cannot believe how lucky I am finally to be writing what I actually want to be writing about. But it took me, kind of 15 years to work it out. It was incredibly dumb of me not to have realized it.
On the sorry to all those people who there are lots of brilliant questions, and I've completely failed to ask any of them because I've got really good, to my mind, good questions of my own, which I want the answers to. So you were talking about seeing the Romans through their own eyes, and obviously that is something that you've been keen on throughout your books, which is you love to get into people's heads, to write, to ventriloquize, to use the kind of indirect style where you're saying how they would think. But if you take Rubicon as an example, there is a sort of that is a book of its moment, right? Of the early 2000s. So, for example, you talk about. I always remember when I first opened the book. I think it's virtually the first page I saw when I opened the book was you're talking about Caesar fighting the pirates, and you say Caesar's war on terror, or something like that. And there's a lot of stuff.
And there's known unknowns, I think, and there's another chapter
exactly,
heading.
known unknowns. So in that, and I think as well in Persian Fire, there are an awful lot of kind of jokes and asides and things like that that are clearly, obviously we're spending a lot of time reading Guardian headlines about the war in Iraq and stuff.
So I was writing Rubicon against the backdrop of 9/11. So on 9/11, I was writing about what was essentially a terrorist attack by a guy called Mithridates, who was the king of Pontus, who the Roman business interests were intruding on his kingdom, and he launched a massacre of Roman and Italian businessmen, which then resulted in a devastating Roman response. And that was the day on which 9/11 happened. And so as I was it repeatedly seemed that I would write all day, and then I would have to go and pick my daughter up at kind of 3:30, look after her, and then I'd make her tea at 5 and put the news on as a backdrop. And it would seem like what I was hearing on the news was a kind of eerie commentary on what I'd been writing about, the embroilment of an imperial republic in Eastern wars, in Near Eastern wars. And when I'd begun the book, I'd been anxious about I thought, well, people would be interested in Gaul because of Asterix, and they'll be interested in Britain because, I was British. But how am I going to make clear the fact that actually the real kind of the focus of real Roman ambition is the East, because it was so rich. But George Bush solved that problem for me, because there were kind of echoes, and it wasn't just. And again, we've talked about this a lot, about how America, of all modern countries, it's not entirely tendentious, I think, to see echoes of Roman history in American history, because the founding fathers were consciously modeling the American Republic on the Roman Republic.
And because so many American policymakers and people who write about foreign policy have used those parallels themselves, haven't they?
And so when I came to Persian Fire, which followed it and was about the Persian wars against Greece, I was writing this against a backdrop of American ideologues, so Paul Wolfowitz and Victor David Hanson and people like that, justifying the Iraq War and American engagement in the Near East by casting the United States as Athens, by casting the West as the heirs of ancient Greece.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
But it seemed to me that got it the wrong way round, because it was the Persians who embodied a notion of good and evil, of there being an axis of evil, because they saw the world as being governed by forces of truth and order, which was synonymous with Persian rule, and beyond their borders were agents of chaos and darkness and untruth.
Well, I was about to say, Rhett Brewerwood has that excellent point about Persian Fire. You talk about how they saw Sparta and Athens as terrorist rogue states that needed to be hit hard, but to teach them a lesson and to stop them, carrying out atrocities on Persian soil, or however the Persians would have put it.
Yes. And Greece, of course, like Afghanistan, was a mountainous backwater full of squabbling people who couldn't, be made to live together. And it was thinking about that, I suppose, that first kind of opened my eyes to how interesting religious traditions could be, because I had not, until I immersed myself in the study of the Persians, appreciated how ideological their empire was.
Okay, let's come to religion in just a second. I just want to answer a question from Louise Proven before I forget it. She said, in your opinion, at what point can someone refer to themselves as a historian? Do they have to have a PhD or have written a book or be working in research or academia? And the obvious answer, I think, Louise, is, so to give Thomas an example, it'd be very weird for somebody, I think, now to deny that Thomas is a historian. Now, I know there will be people on...
Certainly people who do.
You will find university academics on Twitter of a particular persuasion who will say, they're not historians because you need to still be in university employment to qualify. I think that is obviously nonsense. Lots of
I think it is nonsense.
Well done. I knew this was your year. Well done.
What's happened?
No, I
Arthur,
can't say. Yeah.
okay.
But
All right.
all I say
So,
is that the children who belong to Priestland, Leachman, and Bryant are nothing. They are dust beneath our feet. Right, go on,
no
Tom.
idea
Sorry.
what that means. Okay.
Yeah.
So my response to that is that I think that history is unique among academic disciplines in also being a literary genre, and therefore there is an inherent tension in that.
Yeah.
And I'm definitely on the kind of the literary genre side, and scholars who write intense monographs would be on the opposite side. But I think it's a bandwidth.
Will White has
Yeah,
said
well,
something that will please you
thank you, White.
enormously.
Thanks very much.
I think it's fair to say, Tom, Edward Gibbon was a historian, was he not? And
I think
he,
Herodotus was, and I think
yeah, I think,
Tacitus was, and
I'm not
Bede
comparing
was.
us
So
with Tacitus and Herodotus or with Gibbon and Bede, but yeah, I don't think you need to be in university employment. I think you need to write things about history, actually.
yeah.
So you mentioned religion. You did Persian Fire. Yeah, we're taking 25 minutes to be fair. Pud 2602. So we haven't gone into religion just yet because actually Tom wasn't writing about religion early on.
I wasn't interested in it.
You did Persian Fire, and then after Persian Fire, was it Millennium?
I did Millennium. So
which was a book about the year 1000, effectively.
Yes,
the period around the year 1000.
Because when I was thinking about there was a war that Darius the Great fought against a people called the Elamites, and they wouldn't accept his rule. And he ended up so furious that he said to the soldiers he was sending off to fight that they would go to heaven if they fell fighting for him. Because they were fighting for Ahura Mazda, the god of the Persian king, and he was condemning the Elamites not because they were rebels against him, but because they were rebels against Ahura Mazda. And this is something that in the context of the age, it doesn't make sense. It seems so odd. It was like finding, I don't know, digging up the carcass of a Land Rover in a 14th century castle. It seemed completely wrong. It seemed completely out of place because this was redolent of crusade and jihad. And so although it was nothing to do with Persian Fire, I became incredibly interested in how these traditions might have seeped through to inform Christian and Muslim ideology. And also, it was an age when people were obsessed by ideas of Islam being different to Western Europe. And so I wanted to write a book that looked at what had happened to antiquity and in what way might it be legitimate to say that the successor state in Western Europe to the Roman world was different from the Caliphate? And so I seized on the millennium because I had a kind of almost inchoate sense that the 11th century was the key century when things had changed. When I thought, maybe because it changes so radically in England, going from Anglo-Saxon England to the Norman period, but also I was just thinking, it's the age that sees crusades and castles and knights and everything that we associate with the High Middle Ages, and they simply didn't exist before. So what happened in the 11th century? And actually, it was a completely, it was a thrilling intellectual adventure, but it was also very much the runt of the litter, I think, in terms of the books I've done, because it was the least of all those, of all the history that I've done, it's the hardest to get a handle on because the story is quite complex.
As an
the
elevator
hardest to explain.
pitch.
Yeah, which is why we haven't done a series on it yet.
But that's coming. So exciting!
You let me,
so exciting.
You let me do it. Yeah.
I'm not. It's not a question of letting you do it. I want you to do it.
Oh,
so we will be doing a series, 4 episodes, I think it is going to be, on the first millennium in the spring or summer, I can't remember which, and that is definitely happening. And Andrew Bell will be.
Andrew Bell. Well, I love to hear the runt of my litter.
Yeah, we'll just say on the comments, Will Young, you shamed yourself with your Priestland banter, but there you go. Right, Titmus back in the popes. Enough of the prep school houses, back on the popes. So, Tom, Millennium got you into this. You mentioned the Caliphate already. So you were thinking about what had happened to one can see how your mind was working. You're interested
Yeah.
in how the classical world had given way. It's the kind of the great scholar Henri Pirenne had this thesis that without Muhammad there is no Charlemagne, that without the coming of Islam, the Arab conquests, you wouldn't get the splintering of the Roman world that means you have the foundation of these rival kingdoms in
But
Western
also
Europe.
there was another, oh God, I can't remember his name because my brain is going, but there was a German scholar who said that without Alexander there was no Muhammad.
Right.
And
Right.
that
Still happening.
was really what interested me, because of course writing about early medieval Western Europe, Rome is always there in the background. How people are responding to the legacy of Rome, Christian Rome, Imperial Rome, whatever. It's so important. And because the Roman Empire was Christian, it's easy for Christian rulers and churchmen to acknowledge the debt to Rome. There isn't a kind of profound rupture there. But with Islam, it's different, because Islam clearly is a rupture. It destroys the Sasanian Zoroastrian Empire, and it appropriates lands from the Christian Roman Empire, and explains and justifies itself in completely novel terms. And so there was the obvious question: to what extent is Islam a rupture, and to what extent is there continuity? Because when you look at the Dome of the Rock, it has this kind of Archaeopteryx-like quality. It's midway between, architecturally, in architectural terms, it's like looking at a bird that is a dinosaur. You can see the kind of the mid process of evolution, and the Dome of the Rock looks Roman and looks Islamic simultaneously. So you're kind of seeing it mutate. So that was the question that I asked myself, and I pitched it and got a commission, which I thought was, I was surprised to get the commission, because I thought that if the 11th century was obscure, then late antiquity was even more obscure. I couldn't think of any kind of books written for the general public that covered that period. And so that I thought was going to be the big challenge. But of course, the moment I started engaging with the question of where does Islam come from, I found myself up against unbelievably sensitive question, because there didn't seem to be any explanation for where Islam came from that made sense if you weren't a Muslim.
So just on that, had that occurred to you before you pitched the book?
It had occurred to me, but I had thought that that you could make sense of the Muslim tradition, that as I thought it was, that Mecca was a kind of, a great center of commerce, and that it had traditions that would feed into Islam that went back centuries, and that these were all historical, and that the stories that were told about the life of Muhammad could be taken seriously as history, because I'd read Karen Armstrong's biography of Muhammad, and it was lauded as the great introduction to the life of Muhammad. Everyone was reading it in the wake of 9/11, and it didn't cross my mind that it might all absolutely be bogus, but it is bogus, because actually these sources are not history, they're romance. So it would be like reading a biography of King Arthur that is passing itself off as history, that features round tables and bold knights and Guinevere and things. I mean, it's not quite that bad, but it's kind of in that terrain. And the moment I realized that, I was in real real trouble. And also I was in real trouble. Also, I was in deep water. Also, I was in trouble because I didn't speak Arabic, which was the other problem. And I kind of made a vague attempt to start it, but I couldn't even get my head around the script. And so instead, I employed, it's the only time I've ever had a researcher, a Syrian who was a specialist in Syriac. So he spoke Arabic, he spoke Hebrew, and he spoke Syriac, which was the language of Christians in the in late antiquity in the Near East. And so I basically, every text, I would get him to parse it and explain all the different significations of every word that I was looking at. Not every, I think, but I think, say, I mean, I wouldn't have written about the Romans if I didn't have Latin that was good enough to be able to.
Dennis Bergkamp, formerly of
he speaks very good English, doesn't he?
Arsenal and so on. asking, do you need to be able to read the primary sources in the original language? I mean, so for example, in the classical world, I mean, almost all of them are translated, I would imagine. Are they?
Yes, but the translations are treacherous, and the moment
Right.
you know enough to realize that, you realize how difficult it is to convey. And that also became something that became very, very interested in, was how English, it's almost impossible to avoid anachronism using English. So again,
Mhm.
that would, and it was almost like I'd instinctively recognize that with my concern not to use words like discourse or whatever.
Yeah.
But again, right, we've talked about this again on the podcast, that using words like religion or homosexuality seemed wrong, even when I was writing Rubicon, for reasons that I wasn't entirely sure about. Just
Yeah.
instinctively felt wrong to use those. And I realized, of course, that it's because they have very specifically Christian connotations that are a fruit of the fact that English has been uh, saturated with Christian influence for so long. And that was a sense that was sharpened for me by writing about Islam, and a sense of what made Christian medieval Europe distinctive against the Islamic empire of the Middle Ages was a fruit of writing
Yeah.
Shadow of the Sword.
And when you got into writing Shadow of the Sword, you must have, you obviously quite early on must have come across the Hagarism or Hagarism thesis of Patricia Croner and originally Patricia Croner and Michael Cook. So they basically said, we've talked about this a bit before, but for newcomers, that I'm really simplifying it, but the argument effectively in a very bastardized form is that the origins of Islam were invented afterwards, to basically create an imperial creed for the expansionists, new Arab superpower, and
Yeah,
they needed to create a religion that
yeah,
wasn't Judaism or Christianity.
yeah,
And you must have, so you obviously came across that and thought, this is
yeah.
super interesting. I want to kind of give this lots of house room. And at that point, did you think, golly, this could land me in real trouble? Or did you think, no, I'm just going to go for it?
Both.
Okay.
um, I did think it would land me in trouble because everything to do with Islam at that point was so sensitive. So I knew it would generate trouble. But fundamentally, it was the question of, how do you explain Islam if you're not a Muslim?
Yeah.
Because if you're a Muslim, then of course there's not a problem. The Quran
Yeah.
comes from God. But if you don't think the Quran comes from God, then it has to come from somewhere.
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't just spontaneously emerge.
Yeah.
And what would seem to me miraculous and would persuade me to be a Muslim was if the Quran had been written in, I don't know, Peru in the 4th century BC. I mean, that would be bizarre. But the fact that it's written where it is, and it's shot
Hmm.
through with all kinds of texts and ideas and concepts and figures that are current in that period, led me to think, I think the Quran must have come from the great melting pot that was late antiquity.
Yeah, of course. Yeah.
And therefore it must be a fusion of Jewish and Christian elements and Roman and Persian influences there as well, and other various influences. So then the challenge came to basically be to, what are those sources and how did they come to merge in the Quran, and what use was it then put to by the conquerors of the caliphate? And these are unbelievably complex questions, and especially if you don't speak Arabic, because I was having to, so many of the translation issues, or the way that texts had moved, required a knowledge of languages that I didn't speak. So I would have to sit down and, my researcher would have to say, well, this word has this range of significations, this one that. It
Yeah.
seems probable that they might have come from the same source. Yeah, and so Jordan Lee is asking if I've ever been criticized for not speaking Arabic. A lot, a lot. It was an absolute running theme for about 2 years of my experience on Twitter.
Right. And obviously you, for those people who don't know, you did a TV program that was kind of a spin-off of the In the Shadow of the Sword.
Yeah,
That there was a bit of hullabaloo. I mean, a big hullabaloo. You had death threats and all this sort of thing. Um, that you hadn't anticipated at all, and that didn't.
Well, so I went in to see a commissioning editor at Channel 4, and Channel 4, we should explain for non-British listeners and indeed for recent British listeners because it's rather changed, but it was set up to be kind of edgy, different, taking risks, taking on the kind of programs that the BBC wouldn't take. So this was before streaming services.
Yeah.
And it must have been 2012. I went in to see the commissioning editor of the documentaries there. And by that point, Channel 4 had become, a bit middle-aged. It had left its kind of youthful rebelliousness behind it. And so when he said, "What are you writing about?" and I said, "I'm writing a book in which I cast doubt on almost everything that traditional Islam teaches about Muhammad and the Quran and Mecca. So you'd never do it." He took it as a challenge and said, "Actually, I think we will." And so we, rather to my surprise, I found myself making this film, and it was quite stressful making the film because we were going to regions of the Near East and not being able to say what we were going there for. And when the film came out, Channel 4 were torn between feeling, "Oh, this is edgy, brilliant, let's put it out there," woo, and thinking, "Oh God, we might really piss people off here." So they compromised. They put it out in a really good slot, but they didn't actually say what the film was about. And so they wrote, it was kind of Tom Holland goes in search of the Prophet. And so across Britain, Muslim families who many of, there weren't many programs about Islam on TV, thought, "Oh, wonderful, a program about our beloved Prophet. Let's all sit down and watch it." And then I was popping up and saying, "Well, this didn't happen and this didn't happen and that didn't happen." And there was, from a minority, there was an absolute,
oh my word,
explosion of anger. And even before the film had ended, I had a phone call from the anti-terrorism people or the Met or whatever saying, "I think we should come round and check your windows," with not so many words. And I just had kind of vituperative death threats for weeks and weeks. And the irony was, what made it worse was that I was on Twitter, and I'd gone on Twitter because before I made the film, I had I had a friend of a friend who worked in MI5, and so I went to see him and said, "Is this insane? Will I get killed?" And he said, "No, they won't. But what will happen is that people will try and destroy your reputation. They'll say you're a racist, or they'll say that your facts are wrong, whatever. So my advice to you is to find a way to do rapid rebuttal that you can, you can make plain that if people are accusing you of saying things that you didn't, that you can come back." And I thought, well, Twitter's probably the best thing for that. And so I went on it, but it was terrible because I had no experience of it, and so I hadn't kind of twigged that the way that you deal with abuse is just to ignore it. And people would be saying things. I said, "Well, but that's not true. I didn't say that. I've got to reply." And say you'd be coming up and kind of saying, "Please go to bed. It's 3:30 in the morning." I said, "No, but somebody else is saying something wrong."
But Tom,
and it just went on and on
you're
and
not
on.
Getting, you're not getting death threats now, and you're still like that on Twitter.
I'm not. I've kind of learned. And the lesson is that, so the word that the absolute fever pitch of this was there was a kind of big uprising in Benghazi, and the American ambassador there got killed. And the reason that the American ambassador got killed was that a Coptic Christian in LA had produced a film in which he was very, very abusive about Muhammad. And Press TV, which was the Iranian propaganda channel, conflated that with our film and did a half-hour documentary about how they were part of a Zionist plot to defame the Prophet. And that was the one day where everyone was thinking, this could go very Salman Rushdie. You could be being burnt in effigy if this goes wrong. And it didn't, and it died down. And then from that point on, it kind of eased off. But I remember thinking, I remember I met my oldest friend who said, "How are you?" And I said, "Oh, well, bearing up, as well as could be expected." And he said, "Why? What's happened?" He had no idea. And that was basically what cut the whole, "I'm not going to worry about it on Twitter anymore." I suddenly realized most people have no idea. And what I would compare it to is having a massive bruise on the lip that feels awful to you. but no one else can see.
Yeah.
So
To be fair, Tom, probably what happened was that Press TV were on the point of whipping up a campaign against you, but then one of their presenters, Jeremy Corbyn, probably called off the dogs. Do you think that's what happened?
It might be possible, because I was watching Press TV religiously that day. You can imagine. I remember Jeremy Corbyn was on it,
Oh, my
and I did
word.
seriously think, I might have to go and ask him.
Oh no, the shame. Go on,
Yeah.
bended knee to Corbs. Right. So having, you'd yeah, as Theo says, he ended up coming on the podcast. A lovely arc there. He didn't go
Yes.
on the podcast, by the way. But although our executive producer Tony Pastor believed that he had, which I
Yes, he
always
did.
like.
Because my
so-
impression was so convincing.
Because your impression was so good. Right. So we don't want this to be the longest live stream in history. So you had done a book about religion.
Mhm.
You then
The Dynasty, which is about
did another-
Augustus and his family.
yes, much safer territory.
Yeah, much
You wrote
safer.
basically about sort of
Nero.
yeah, I Claudius. You basically did
Yeah,
I
it
Claudius,
was I Claudius,
the
yeah.
history, and then you went. The book that's probably, apart from Rubicon, your best known book, the book that I imagine has brought a lot of people actually to this podcast. Certainly, all these vicars who are always popping up in the comments, was Dominion, a book about Christianity. Now, this was the first book you did, which was about all history. So you didn't tell a story that concentrated on a century or on a moment or an episode or a society. This is like all world history. And it's how
Yeah, it was
Christianity shaped the
insanely
world.
overambitious.
Incredibly overambitious. And what made you, what on earth made you do that? I mean, obviously it was very successful. But
Because I had come to the conclusion over the course of writing the history books that I'd been writing that this was a thesis that I wanted to stress test, and the only way I could stress test it was by writing about it. And I kind of enjoyed the challenge of it. I mean, I found it quite nerve-wracking doing it, but also very, very enjoyable. And I was torn between, as I was doing it, thinking, this is all so obvious. I'm just pointing out, I mean, it's so obvious, everyone could see this. And then thinking, nobody's going to accept this. Everyone's, this seems nonsense. And I was very relieved by the time I finished that I hadn't disproved my own thesis, because that was there was a degree of jeopardy to it, because I wasn't.
You were never going to disprove your own thesis.
Well, but I'll give you an example. So, as I was writing it, I was thinking of all the things that aren't Christian, and I was going to think, well, I have to admit that attitudes to sex and gender, say, are have changed so radically. And I was kind of thinking of the sexual revolution of the 60s, that basically that Christian notions of sexual morality have gone, and I have to put my hands up. But as I was writing it, the Harvey Weinstein scandal broke, and the Just Say No movement, and it seemed to me that only made sense in the context of a world where not just women but men took for granted that kind of priapic male dominant aggression sexually was something to be utterly condemned. And I knew from writing about the Romans, because I'd just been writing about the Julia Claudian court, that this wasn't this wasn't a given, that Roman sexuality was radically, into our way of thinking, unnervingly different. And it's the image of the women's marches that followed in the wake of Harvey Weinstein and Donald Trump being elected. Me Too. No. Yeah. Sorry, Me Too.
Just Say No is Nancy Reagan.
Yeah, it's been a long day. That so many protesters were dressing up as handmaids from the dramatization of the Margaret Atwood novel, which is about it's a kind of nightmare Puritan state that gets reconfigured. That the paradoxes and the ironies of that were kind of perfect, a perfect way to end the book. So and I have to say that if I had, it came out in 2019, so just before COVID. And then 2020 seemed a kind of wildly apocalyptic, Reformation-esque
Yeah.
year. The Black Lives Matter, all the protests, the anxieties about pandemics and everything. I mean, none of that made me think I got the thesis wrong. I mean, it seemed
No.
absolutely to confirm the thesis.
I mean, your Dominion is to some degree.
Oh, look at Ian
responsible for
McKinney.
Yeah, giving you very, very
Yeah, I
high
love
praise.
love
Look at
Ian
him in his,
McKinney. That's a great
what's
comment.
that, Huddersfield Town shirt or something in his picture. He says it's one of the most important books of the last 50 years, post 1960s.
Love
So
it.
it's very important, Ian, because probably if you hadn't done Dominion, there might be no rest is history. Because
There would
one of the
definitely not
last,
have been rest in history. Yeah,
because one of
there
the
definitely
last
wouldn't.
public events that we did, either of us did before the pandemic hit. I mean, you must have done loads actually to do it, Dominion, but certainly one of the last events that I did was interviewing you about it at a book festival. It brought Andres Horcajo, I can't do it properly. It brought him back to God, but that's less important, I think, Andres, than
the rest is history.
inspiring the rest is history. But we did this interview, didn't we, at the Budley Silverstone Literary Festival, talking about it. And I'd seen that you were doing it, and I was kind of a bit skeptical of the thesis, and then was reading it and just thought, God, yeah, like everybody else, it's been hiding in plain sight. It's kind of that classic thing of thinking on the one hand, oh, this is so obvious. Tom has found something very obvious here, but also absolute jealousy that you'd found something that nobody else had.
But that's what I was nervous about, because it did seem completely obvious, but at the same time, nobody else seemed to be writing about it. So that was the
and then you had this remarkable stroke. So Erin had the same reaction as me. Now you've pointed it out, you spot it everywhere. Now that you say all that, we think that because it's the influence of Christianity, we think this happens, that happens. Once you started to notice it, you can't stop, which is absolutely right. And that was particularly the case in 2020, wasn't it? Because I can remember when the post George Floyd kind of hullabaloo was all happening, thinking, God Almighty, it's like Tom Holland's book is coming true. Because it was, and did you think did you really think that at the time? Were you
completely
sitting there with a smug smile on your face as the statues were falling?
Yeah, kind of, but I felt nervous about making that argument, because there was such passionate intensity. And one of the things that's so interesting is that although there were certainly lots of protesters who would have identified themselves with the Christian tradition, there were lots who didn't, but for very Christian reasons, I would argue. But it was, I mean, kind of saying to people who were motivated by the most impassioned convictions that in a way they think what they think because they're the consequence of centuries and millennia of contingent, moral and theological evolution. I thought, well, there's a time to make that argument, and this probably isn't it.
The people who are really enraged by your book, of course, Tom, are not academics; they're humanists.
Yes, because I was kind of a humanist, and so I'm an apostate. And I think that the I've just been stabbed on BBC Two. Brilliant. People always hate apostates.
Yeah.
Not least because the apostate knows your weakest point.
Yeah. And I think because a humanist would say, I'm not Christian at all. And humanism is not informed by Christianity. So
they would.
I reject your claim that I'm influenced, wouldn't they? Just a quick question earlier on. Somebody asked about, you published your book at about the same time that a writer called Catherine Nixie published a book called The Darkening Age, where she was also writing about the influence of Christianity, but from a totally different perspective. So that was basically, she thought the classical world was brilliant, and then Christianity ruined it for everybody, which is the complete opposite of your own perspective. So I can't remember who was the question.
So hers is a very overtly polemical Gibbonian Enlightenment style, the darkening age, that the Roman Empire was a period of light, and that Christianity brings darkness, which is immediately to moralize it. I am very pointedly not saying that Christianity improves the world, because I'm not writing as a moralist or a theologian.
Yeah.
What I would say, I mean, I'm not saying that Christianity is responsible for the good things in Western culture, but what I'm saying is that Christianity is, I think, responsible for the things that people in the West think is good, which is different.
Okay, fine. So since we've talked about historians, we had a question about 6 years ago in the chat about the historians that have who are your favorite historians, the ones that have most influenced you? There we go, Julian Johnston.
So we did the five
Books, didn't we?
the 5 books. So I nominated Herodotus as my absolute love, who I think is kind of my presiding inspiration as a historian. And I mentioned Simon Sharma's Embarrassment of Riches, which kind of opened my eyes to how you could veil narrative in discussions of washing or gardens or whatever. It was a big influence on how I came to write Rubicon and everything that's followed. Who else? I should say Patricia Croner, who you discussed, who wrote Hagerism, and who didn't rest content with Hagerism. Over the course of her life, she refined and refined and refined her opinion, and she kind of ended up arguing that, which is kind of the obvious thing, that the Quran and early Islam is to be understood in the context of late antiquity, and that was what she worked on. She was hated as no contemporary historian has been hated, because her history was seen by lots of devout believers as being very, very threatening. But she was never cowed. She was fearless. She was also, in print, she was very, she did not suffer fools gladly, but in person, she was incredibly kind. And I got to film her as part of the film we made for Channel 4, and it was one of the great honors of my life. She died of a brain tumor a couple of years after that, but I was just incredibly glad to have met her. And she was and is a huge inspiration. And I think that maybe in 100 years' time, people will look back and see her as being one of the great intellectual figures of our age.
Wow, that's a nice tribute, Tom.
She was, I think, the greatest historian that I've met, yourself accepted, of course, Dominic.
I wondered where that was going for a second there, Tom. Titmus says the scriptwriters of Mamma Mia are Tom's favourite historians, because you're on record, aren't you, saying Mamma Mia 2 is one of the all-time great films. Just a couple of quick questions before we depart, because we don't want to keep everybody all night.
Dominic, we should just say, just one further thing on Dominion.
Yeah.
Which is that
you don't feel we talk about it enough on the rest of history.
But also just to say that you said that without Dominion, probably we wouldn't have done the rest of history, and that's because of the Budley Salterton meetup, and we kind of renewed our friendship, which had slightly gone into abeyance. But also the fact that I'd covered all these different periods of history gave me the confidence, I think, when we were discussing what the focus of the podcast should be, to say, oh, well, let's go for the whole sweep, because if in doubt, I could always do stuff on Catherine of Siena, which indeed came to pass.
Yeah, that's right. So
having actually now, written about the American War of Independence and the Nazis and so on, I felt more confident in doing that. So I think that it was important for that reason as well.
Very good. So a couple more quick questions. Carlos Sergio Martino asks, could you talk about translating? You talked a bit about translating earlier, but you obviously have done translations of your own, Herodotus, and you've got one on Suetonius, the most recent. Yeah. So that's obviously a totally different activity from writing history.
It is, but it's again, it involves trying to get in the heads of an ancient people. Both in terms of what's being written about, because you're trying to make sense, particularly the passages that seem odd or disconcerting or aberrant or bizarre. You're trying to make sense of them and think, imagine that I'm a person to whom this is completely natural, but going deep into the actual process of translation. That's true of of individual words, of grammatical constructions, of the way that sentences are constructed, of the way that a writer in Latin or Greek is is conceptualizing the world through the prism of language. And it's not so different to writing history, I think.
Okay. Yeah, very good. Now, a couple more very quick questions. A lot of people have asked, when are you going to do a series about the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth? They didn't think I'd
Well,
ask it,
Dominic,
but I have.
we are agreed, aren't we, that this will be our last ever episode? No, our penultimate episode, and then we will finish with snooker.
I thought we said
And
that
it would be
snooker would be the 1000th episode, didn't we?
Maybe disagreements. I thought we were going to. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth will be the penultimate. We do a big series,
Yeah.
and then snooker, and that's the trump of doom.
Oh my word, that would be terrible when people
will
see the
go,
announcements. Yeah, we're doing this. Peter Kanev says, when is the series on the Dutch coming?
Not for a year, I think, because we're not.
No, we've done a
we
little
will
bit
do.
on the
We will
Dutch
do
this
the
year.
Dutch.
The Dutch. So we have been talking to a historian about doing the Dutch, haven't we? Very well-known
Very
historian.
distinguished historian.
Yeah.
Yes.
I notice he's getting pelters, as they say in the rest goal hanger towers.
Who? The famous historian.
On the chat, not just on Twitter from academics, but on the chat as well. Rosalind Tedford. Honestly, they talk about the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth and Empire and their Russian Empire series, and it sounds kind of interesting. I haven't listened to this podcast, Tom. Have you? This other podcast. So
because I don't want to be influenced.
Right, is another reason. Yeah. I just don't want to double their audience. So I feel terrible because Callum was probably the producer. He probably is tuned in for this, and he's sick of getting abuse from us. Yeah.
Rhett Breerwood has asked, when is 100 Years Part 2?
Okay, so
in
do you want
February.
To talk them through
so
what you're doing for 100 Years
so
War
we're slightly
Part 2.
cheating with 100 Years because, of course, 100 Years War carries on throughout the reigns of Richard II and Henry IV. So we are doing Part 2 of the 100 Years War, but it is covering the reign of Richard II. So that we've recorded 4 episodes.
Theo's correcting you.
Sorry, halftime. Yeah. So we've done 2 on the Peasants' Revolt. We've done 1 on the deposition of Richard II, and we've done 1 on the Canterbury Tales. Then we will do Henry IV Part 1 and 2, and then we will get back into the action.
So 4 of those are recorded.
Agincourt, Joan of Arc, all that. So it is coming.
And I'm looking at all the comments about, more, do some single episodes, do this, do that. Ireland, we will get back to Ireland. We were planning to do it in the next sort of 6 months, but that probably isn't going to happen now. But it will happen. We can't do everything. So
I mean, the thing is, Dominic, we've set up long-running series that we will carry on. So there's no reason why we shouldn't carry on after doing the 100 Years' War into the Wars of the Roses and the Tudors and so on. And likewise with American history, Roman history, whatever.
Yeah, the Troubles, for those people asking.
The Nazis we're doing.
We're going to come back to the Nazi series, talking about the Third Reich in power, how it operated.
And Ireland, we will definitely do the War of Independence and the Civil War, and in the long run, the Troubles as well.
So I was just about to say the Troubles will come to after we've finished the Irish War of Independence. The French Revolution is coming in the summer, timed for the Paris. I hate saying this because it gives Dan Snow ideas. So if you missed the French Revolution series, you can hear a 25-minute episode on History Hit a week after we finish. Anyway, the French Revolution series will come out in time for the Paris Olympics. What else?
Churchill. Yeah, so we're going to carry on Churchill, aren't we?
Yeah, we are. We're definitely. So we'll be doing Gallipoli
and Napoleon.
We'll be doing. And Napoleon will be coming back to James Callaghan. Again, he's a big hitter. We want to save him for.
But we are doing a series on 1974.
Yeah, a couple of episodes about the
Britain's worst year.
About Britain in 1974. I'm just looking at all the other suggestions. Giordano Bruno. We don't have anything coming. Female Pope, says Becca Brown. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Okay, so we'll tell you what's coming over the next few weeks. So on Thursday, my brother is our guest, and he's talking about the Allied campaign in Italy in 1943. Then we have Zadie Smith talking about Britain's weirdest law case, which is the Tichborne claimant.
Victorian scandal, Victorian
who's
trial.
A large non-French speaking butcher who pretends to be a very thin French speaking aristocrat. Then
Yeah.
we have an episode on the Windrush, which is the people from the Caribbean coming to Britain. Then on Christmas Day, we're going to be looking at Roman Christmas. Then we have the mystery of the pregnant Pope. So that's Pope Joan. Tom's Roman Christmas. Yeah,
that's what I want to call
title, the working title. And then we have 6 episodes on the Third Reich in power.
Yeah. And then we have, so just thinking further ahead in the year, just to give people an idea of we want to do Peter the Great and the Great Northern War. We've had a lot of requests for the Great Northern War, so we are going to be doing that. We are going to do Peron and Evita. We're going to be doing Carthage and the Punic Wars. Tom is going to be talking about Byron, but not just Byron. It's also about the Ottoman Empire, Greece,
celebrity culture in the Regency.
Yeah. We're going to be doing some episodes about Native Americans, about Romulus and Remus, about the Dreyfus case, about the first millennium, about Boudica, about the Borgias, Muhammad Ali, Shakespeare, big series about Shakespeare. We do have a lot of bookings in Rhett. Rhett asked if we're booked through to 2029. I think it's fair to say we're booked through to 2025. But keep the ideas coming.
Yeah. Oh, Titanic we've got.
Yeah. Now the big thing, Stanley Baldwin series, again, we're saving that for later. I got a couple of somebody asking about the series on the Act of Union, or the episode on the Act of Union, Tom, which was one that you were very keen to book in, and indeed has been recorded.
It has been recorded, but I think we'll never emerge to see the light of day.
And the Habsburgs with a Habsburg, that's also been recorded, but that will see the light of day.
That is absolutely will come. That's coming.
But that is kind of the new Viking sorcery.
Yeah, we're just toying with you.
So some of the others, the Chamberlains, I would love to do the Chamberlains. Tim G, I would love to do the Glorious Revolution, Will White, and I'm sure we really want to do, the English Civil War and all that sort of stuff properly.
We've got so much to do. We're going to be doing
just looking at all the suggestions. RFK, a lot of people have said, why don't you do my first ever, not my first ever piece of research, my second ever piece of research was on Robert Kennedy, my master's thesis. So
we're going to have some kind of Robert Kennedy adjacent material, aren't we? Ready for the American election.
Oh yeah. For the American election, we're going to be doing absolutely 1968. Now somebody says, where's it gone? There's a huge stream of people saying, what about this? What about this? But excellently named Mike Goat Killer says, need another bird stroke animal series. Tom, do you want to tell them the animal series?
Okay. So we are going to be doing history's top 7 monkeys.
History's greatest monkeys.
Yeah. So that is something definitely to look forward to.
Yeah. And the Jacobites.
And
Jacobites.
Yeah, so we're doing Bonnie Prince Charlie. Because I think there's a general feeling, which is entirely justified, that we haven't done much Scottish history. And we're doing Romans in space, aren't we?
Yeah, that's yeah. And I'm sorry to say, there is still in the schedule. I'm just going to throw it out there to see what the reaction is. There is I still see the words Chatham High Street.
Yeah, we're doing Chatham High Street. That is Britain's most historic street.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. So listen, thank you everybody. Thank you to everybody for joining. I'm sorry we didn't answer loads of indeed the vast majority of your questions. But that's just the nature of it, and the rest is history. We tried to do some, but we can't do them all. We are, especially as we approach this festive time of year, we are incredibly grateful, aren't we, Tom? For your support all year. It's brilliant to have so many people supporting the podcast, listening every week, tuning in for the live streams, the Athelstans. Lex,
a couple of
I feel Lex is being
drinking.
Taking
crack.
So thank you all so much for your support. We wish you a very, very Merry Christmas, don't we, Tom? We'll be seeing the Athelstans, or at least some of them, in January for the great Athelstan get together. The rest of you, we will see you in the next live stream, which will be in January. And Tom, an absolute tour de force, as always.
Thank you very much, Dominic. Thank you very much.
And on that bombshell,
thank you everyone for coming and for listening, for putting up with me. Thanks very much.
Yeah. Bye-bye.
Bye bye.